Jason's hand was already on the folder when I spoke, calm enough to freeze the entire room. "You might want to read the last page first," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. He frowned, flipping to the back, and I watched the color drain from his face faster than I'd seen in 72 years of living. Emily leaned in, her manicured nails gripping his sleeve, but the moment her eyes scanned the document, she pulled back like it had burned her. This isn't right," she whispered. "Oh, it's very right," I replied, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "Every conversation you had about me, every plan, every calculation about my house being worth $900,000, I recorded it. Through the baby monitor you thought was just for your convenience." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was suffocating. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You see," I continued, 2 weeks ago, after I heard you suggest putting me in a nursing home like I was a piece of furniture to be stored away, I made a few calls. My attorney has everything. The recordings, the transcripts, and a formal complaint filed for elder financial abuse." Emily's composure shattered first. "Margaret, you can't do this. We were just planning my removal so you could sell my home," I finished for her, still calm. "Yes, I know exactly what you were doing." Jason slammed the folder shut, his hands shaking. "Mom, we can fix this. We didn't mean—" "You meant every word," I said, standing slowly. "And now you'll face every consequence." I reached into my bag and placed another document on the table. "This is the updated deed. The house is no longer in any structure you can touch. It's been transferred into an irrevocable trust managed by my attorney. You have no claim, no leverage, nothing." Jason stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. You took everything?" "No," I corrected softly. "I protected what was always mine." Emily's voice dropped to a hiss. "Then why are we even here?" I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. "Because I wanted you to hear it from me before the legal notices arrive. There's also the matter of the recordings being submitted. Public record tends to be unforgiving." Jason's knees seemed to weaken as he sank into his chair. "Our reputations," he muttered. "Your choices." I replied. "Your consequences." I picked up my coat, smoothing it over my shoulders. For the first time since my husband passed, I felt something solid beneath my feet again. Control. Clarity. Power. At the door I paused just long enough to look back at them. Two people who thought I was alone, weak, and easy to erase. "You thought I was listening to lullabies through that monitor," I said quietly. "I was listening to you." Then I walked out, leaving them with nothing but the echo of their own betrayal and the realization that the house they tried to take had never been theirs to begin with. "Put her in a nursing home. The house is worth $900,000 anyway," my son said, his voice low but clear enough to carry through the tiny speaker sitting on my nightstand. And for a moment I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink, because I knew that voice better than my own, and yet I had never heard it sound like that before. Not cold, not calculated, not like I was something to be managed instead of a person who had raised him for 45 years. And I sat there in the dim light of my bedroom, the soft glow from the digital clock reading 10:42 p.m., listening as if the walls themselves had turned against me and decided to tell the truth. Emily answered him, her tone softer but sharper in a way that made my stomach tighten. "We can't wait too long, Jason. If she changes anything, we lose everything." And there it was, not just a suggestion, not just a passing frustration, but a plan, something they had discussed before, something that had weight and intention behind it. And I felt the air in the room grow heavier, as if the house I had lived in for over 30 years was suddenly no longer mine but already slipping through my fingers in ways I hadn't noticed until now. I didn't cry, not then, not when I probably should have, because something inside me went very still instead, the kind of stillness that comes when your mind understands something your heart hasn't caught up to yet. And I reached over slowly, my hand steady despite the tremor I felt inside, and turned the volume down just enough to keep their voices from spilling too loudly into the room, because I didn't want to miss a single word they said about me, about my life, about the home my husband and I had built together brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, sacrifice by sacrifice. "She's not going to suspect anything," Jason continued, and I could picture him leaning back in that kitchen chair, the one with the loose leg I'd been meaning to fix, the same chair he used to sit in as a boy, swinging his feet while I cooked dinner, asking me questions about everything and nothing, and now he was sitting there deciding where I belonged as if I were a problem to be solved. Emily let out a small laugh, quiet but unmistakable. Of course she won't. She still thinks this is her house. And that was the moment something shifted completely, not shattered, not broken, but rearranged into something colder, something clearer, something that no longer needed their approval or their kindness to feel secure. Because I realized then that whatever they thought they were planning, whatever future they were quietly building without me, they had made one mistake, one small, careless mistake that changed everything. They forgot I could hear them, and I had always been a very good listener. I did not sleep that night, not because of fear but because the silence in the house felt different, like it was no longer mine to rest in. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every word I had heard, not changing them, not softening them, just letting them sit exactly as they were, sharp and deliberate, until they stopped hurting and started making sense. And by the time the first light slipped through the curtains, I was no longer confused about what was happening, I was simply aware of it. The kitchen smelled like coffee when I walked in, the same dark roast I had been buying for years, but now it felt like a stranger had chosen it, like every familiar thing had quietly shifted ownership overnight. And Jason was already sitting at the table scrolling through his phone, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, as if the night before had been ordinary, as if he had not discussed sending me away like I was an inconvenience that came with property taxes. "Morning, Mom," he said without looking up, and I studied him for a moment, really studied him, the lines around his eyes, the way his hair had started to gray at the temples, the same boy who used to run through this house in socks that never stayed clean for more than an hour. And I wondered when exactly that boy had learned to measure his mother in square footage and market value. "Good morning," I replied, my voice steady, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, noticing how my hands no longer trembled the way they had the night before, because something had settled inside me, something quiet but firm, like a decision I did not need to announce to anyone. Emily walked in a few minutes later, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, dressed neatly even at this hour, her smile already in place before she spoke. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, and I looked at her, really looked, the careful makeup, the polite tone, the practiced warmth, and I realized how easy it must have been for her to say those things while planning something entirely different behind my back. "Very well," I said, and I meant it in a way she could not possibly understand. We sat there together, the three of us, the morning light filling the room, and for a moment it almost looked like a normal family, a mother having coffee with her son and daughter-in-law, but beneath that surface there was something else now, something unspoken but undeniable, and I watched them move through their routines, the small exchanges, the glances they thought I did not notice, the quiet coordination that now felt rehearsed instead of natural. "I was thinking," Jason said casually, finally setting his phone down, "maybe we should start looking at some options for you, something more manageable." And there it was again, not as blunt as the night before, not as cold, but carrying the same intention underneath, and I nodded slowly as if I were considering it for the first time. "That might be a good idea," I said, and Emily's eyes flickered with something quick and satisfied before she masked it again. And in that brief moment I understood something important. They believed they were ahead of me, they believed I was still unaware, still trusting, still easy to guide, and that belief was going to be their biggest mistake. I took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and I said nothing more because there was nothing I needed to say yet, not until I had heard everything, not until I had seen the full shape of what they were trying to do. And as Jason started talking about listings and locations, his tone practical, almost helpful, I simply listened, the same way I had the night before, only now I was listening with purpose. That afternoon I found myself standing in the hallway outside the guest room, the one they had converted into a nursery 6 months ago, and I looked at the small white device sitting on the dresser, the baby monitor they had set up so they could hear every little sound during the night, and I realized how strange it was that something meant to protect a child had become the one thing that revealed the truth about the adults in this house, and I stepped inside quietly, closing the door just enough so it would not latch, my fingers brushing against the edge of the crib as I moved toward the monitor, not to touch it, not to adjust it, but simply to be near it, to understand it, because now it was no longer just a piece of technology, it was a window, and I needed to know how wide that window could open. I stood there for a moment listening to the faint static hum, and I remembered when Jason was a baby, when I used to sit up all night just to make sure he was breathing, counting the seconds between each small rise and fall of his chest, never imagining that one day I would be listening just as carefully, not for his safety, but for his intentions. And the thought did not make me angry, not in the way I expected. It made me focused, because anger would have clouded what I needed to see clearly. Later that evening, after dinner plates had been cleared and the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, I returned to my room and placed the monitor closer to my bed, not hiding it, not disguising it, simply repositioning it like someone adjusting a lamp for better light. And when I sat down, I did not rush, I did not anticipate, I just waited because I had learned something important the night before. Truth does not need to be chased, it reveals itself when people believe no one is paying attention. It was not long before their voices returned, softer this time, measured, careful, but still careless enough to carry through the connection they had forgotten about. And I listened as Emily spoke first, her tone lower, almost thoughtful. If we listed in early spring, we could easily get over 900, maybe even more depending on the market. And Jason responded with a quiet agreement, the kind that did not question, did not hesitate, just accepted the plan as if it were already in motion. We just need to make sure everything is in place before we move her, he said, and there was a pause, a small one, but enough for me to hear what was not being said. Enough for me to understand that this was no longer an idea they were considering, it was something they were preparing for. I leaned back slightly against the headboard, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I let their words settle into something solid, something I could work with because now I had more than suspicion, I had clarity, and clarity changes everything. They talked about timelines, about contacting someone who could help with arrangements, about making it seem like the decision was for my benefit, and I realized how carefully they had constructed this, how much thought had gone into presenting it as concern instead of convenience, and for the first time I saw the full shape of what they believed they were controlling, not just my living situation but the narrative itself, the story they would tell to justify what they were doing. I did not interrupt, I did not move, I did not even sigh because every word mattered now, every detail, every assumption they made about me. And as their voices eventually faded and the house returned to silence, I reached over and picked up my phone, not to call anyone yet, not to act too quickly, but to begin something far more important. I opened the recording app and pressed a single button, because if they were going to plan my future without me, then I was going to make sure I had every piece of it documented, every intention preserved exactly as it was spoken. And as I set the phone back down beside the monitor, I realized something that made everything feel different. They thought they were preparing to take control, but they had already given me everything I needed to take it back. The next morning I walked through the house more slowly than usual, not because I was tired but because I was seeing everything differently, as if each room had started telling a story I had never bothered to question before. And I paused in the living room where the sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor, touching the edges of furniture my husband and I had chosen together more than 30 years ago, and I could almost hear his voice again, calm and certain, telling me that this house was not just a place to live but something we built with intention, something meant to last beyond us. And for the first time since he passed, I understood exactly what he meant, not in a sentimental way but in a practical one. I ran my fingers along the back of the sofa, remembering the night we brought it home in a rented truck because we wanted to save on delivery fees, laughing as we struggled to fit it through the front door. And I realized how much of this house was made up of moments like that, small decisions, quiet sacrifices, years of effort layered into something solid, something real. And it became very clear to me that what Jason and Emily saw as $900,000 was never just a number, it was a lifetime, and that was something they had never taken the time to understand. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet where I kept old documents, not the important ones, just the ones I had never gotten around to organizing, and I pulled out a folder that had my husband's handwriting on the front, neat and deliberate, the way he always labeled things, and I sat down at the table, flipping through pages that felt heavier now than they ever had before, not because they were new, but because I was finally looking at them with the right questions in mind. There were insurance papers, property tax records, notes about repairs we had planned but never completed, and tucked between them I found something I had not thought about in years, a letter he had written, not long, not dramatic, just a simple explanation of how he wanted things handled if something ever happened to him, and as I read it, I felt that same quiet steadiness return, the same clarity that had started forming the night before, because his words were not emotional, they were precise, they reflected a kind of foresight I had underestimated, and in that moment I understood that I was not as unprepared as Jason and Emily believed I was. I closed the folder carefully, placing it back exactly where I had found it, because there was no need to make any visible changes yet, no need to alert anyone that I had started to connect the pieces, and when I stood up I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly the way I used to when things felt overwhelming, except now nothing felt overwhelming, it felt manageable, structured, almost methodical. Later, when Emily asked if I wanted help sorting through some of my belongings, suggesting it might make things easier when the time came to transition. I simply smiled and thanked her, keeping my voice light, agreeable, exactly what she expected to hear. And as she walked away, satisfied with my response, I watched her for a moment, not with resentment, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of detached understanding, because I could see the shape of their plan more clearly now, and, more importantly, I could see exactly where it would fail. And as I turned back toward the hallway, my step steady and unhurried, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. They believed this house was something they could take, but they had no idea how much of it was already protected. And they had no idea that I was no longer the person they thought they could move without consequence. I waited 2 days before making the first move, not because I needed time to think but because I needed them to believe nothing had changed, and during those 2 days I watched everything more closely than I ever had before. The way Jason checked his phone after certain conversations, the way Emily lowered her voice when she thought I was out of earshot, the small pauses between their words that carried more meaning than what they actually said, and it became clear to me that they were not just planning something in theory, they were already taking steps, quiet ones, careful ones, but steps nonetheless. On the third morning after Jason left for work and Emily busied herself in the backyard talking on her phone, I picked up mine and dialed a number I had not used in years, a number I had almost forgotten I had, and when the voice on the other end answered familiar and steady, I felt something settle into place inside me, something that reminded me I was not alone, not in the way they thought I was. "This is Margaret Collins," I said, my voice even, controlled, and there was a brief pause before recognition returned on the other end, followed by a tone that carried both respect and concern, the kind that comes from someone who remembers more than just your name. We did not talk long, not yet, just enough for me to confirm what I needed to know, just enough to understand the options that were still very much within my reach, and when I ended the call I did not feel anxious or uncertain, I felt prepared. That afternoon I made a small change, one that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not paying attention. I adjusted the position of the monitor again, angling it slightly differently, ensuring that not only could I hear clearly, but that I could also capture everything with precision, because hearing was no longer enough. Now I needed proof, something that could not be denied or explained away. That evening, as expected, their voices returned, more confident now, more detailed, as if they were getting closer to a conclusion they believed was inevitable. And I listened as Jason mentioned scheduling a visit to a facility, describing it as just to explore options, while Emily discussed timing, paperwork, and how to approach the conversation with me so it would sound like concern instead of strategy. And as I sat there recording every word, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. They were not just underestimating me, they were relying on that underestimation as the foundation of their entire plan. "She will not push back," Emily said quietly, and Jason agreed without hesitation, and in that moment I understood that their confidence was not based on strength, it was based on assumption, and assumptions are fragile things when they are tested against reality. I did not move, I did not react, I simply let them continue, gathering every detail, every timeline, every expectation they had built around me, and when their voices finally faded and the house returned to silence once again, I reached over and stopped the recording, looking at the small screen of my phone as if it held something far more valuable than any property value they had been discussing, because what I had now was not just knowledge, it was leverage, and leverage, when used correctly, changes everything. I set the phone down carefully, my hand steady, my breathing even, and I allowed myself a moment to sit with that realization, not in triumph, not yet, but in quiet certainty, because for the first time since I heard them speak that night, I was no longer reacting to what they were planning, I was preparing for what I was going to do next. The next step did not require urgency, it required precision, and that was something I had learned over decades of managing a household, raising a child, and building a life where mistakes were not always loud but often permanent. So I moved carefully, choosing each action with intention rather than emotion, and the first thing I did was something so simple it would have seemed insignificant to anyone watching. I began to agree with them. At breakfast, when Jason mentioned touring a facility again, I nodded slowly, setting my cup down with deliberate calm. "That sounds reasonable," I said, and I watched the brief flicker of surprise pass between them, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of reaction people have when reality does not behave the way they expect it to, and I kept my expression neutral, almost thoughtful, as if I were considering their suggestion for the first time instead of responding to a plan I had already heard in full detail. "I just want what is best for you," Emily added quickly, her tone warm, practiced, and I met her eyes for a moment, long enough to acknowledge her words without challenging them, because this was not the moment for confrontation, This was the moment for reinforcement. I needed them to feel safe in their assumptions, comfortable in their belief that I was unaware, because comfort makes people careless. Over the next few days, I continued in the same way, asking small questions, the kind that made me appear cooperative rather than suspicious. What kind of place were you thinking about? Is it close by? Would I still have my own space? And each question drew more information from them, more details about their timeline, their expectations, the way they had already begun to structure a future that did not include me in this house. And I listened, storing everything, not reacting, not correcting, just allowing them to build their confidence piece by piece. Meanwhile, I kept recording every evening, every conversation that slipped through their lowered voices and careful tones. And the more they spoke, the more consistent their story became, not just between each other but in the way they began to present it to me, refining their language, adjusting their approach, making it sound less like removal and more like support. And it was almost impressive the way they worked together, the way they believed they were controlling the narrative, shaping it into something that would make their decision seem reasonable, even kind. One afternoon, Emily showed me brochures, glossy pages filled with smiling faces and bright common areas, describing amenities and activities, her voice gentle as she pointed to different sections. You would not have to worry about maintenance anymore, she said, and I nodded, tracing the edge of the paper with my finger, as if I were genuinely considering it. And in that moment I realized something important. They were not expecting resistance, they were expecting acceptance, and that expectation had made them vulnerable. That evening, after they had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the quiet settling around me in a way that no longer felt empty but focused, and I reviewed the recordings, listening not just for content but for patterns, for consistency, for anything that could strengthen what I was building, because this was no longer about understanding what they were doing. I already understood that. This was about preparing for the moment when everything would need to be undeniable. I placed my phone on the table, looking at the list of files, each one marked with a date and time, each one holding a piece of the truth they thought was hidden, and I allowed myself a small breath, steady and controlled, because I knew now that I was not behind them, not catching up to their plan. I was ahead of it, shaping the outcome before they even realized there was one to shape. And as I turned off the light and made my way upstairs, my steps quiet against the floor, I understood something with complete certainty. They believed they were guiding me toward a decision, but in reality, they were walking directly into mine. By the end of the week, their confidence had settled into something almost visible, like a quiet certainty that everything was unfolding exactly as they had planned, and I could see it in the way Jason spoke more openly now, no longer testing the waters but moving forward with decisions, and in the way Emily stopped watching me so closely, as if she had already placed me into a category that required no further attention. And that was when I knew it was time to take the next step, not a large one, not anything that would disrupt their expectations, but something precise, something that would begin shifting the foundation beneath them without making a sound. That morning, after they had both left the house, I returned to the folder I had found days earlier, the one with my husband's handwriting, and I opened it again, this time not just reading but organizing, separating documents into clear groups, identifying what was current, what needed updating, and what could be reinforced. And I made notes, small ones, written in a way that only I would understand, because this was not about creating something new. It was about strengthening what already existed. Later that afternoon I made another call, longer this time, more detailed, and I spoke carefully, explaining what I had heard, what I had recorded, what I suspected they intended to do. And the response I received was not surprised, not alarmed, but measured, professional, confirming that what I was doing was not only appropriate but necessary. And when the call ended, I felt something shift again, not inside me, but around me, as if the situation itself had moved into a different phase, one where I was no longer reacting to their actions but actively shaping the outcome. That evening, when Jason returned home, he mentioned that he had scheduled a visit for the following week, his tone casual, almost helpful, and I responded with the same calm agreement I had maintained all week. That sounds fine, I said, and I watched as he relaxed slightly, reassured by my cooperation, and Emily followed with a small smile, adding something about how it would be good to explore options early. And I nodded again, allowing them to continue building their narrative without interruption. But what they did not see, what they could not possibly anticipate, was that while they were preparing to move me out, I was preparing to lock everything in place, and that preparation had already begun. Over the next 2 days I made quiet adjustments, small but significant, updating contact information, securing documents in places they would not think to look, ensuring that every piece of the structure my husband had put in place was not only intact but reinforced. And all the while I continued to listen, to record, to observe, because their conversations had become even more revealing now, filled with assumptions about timing, about how easily everything would fall into place once I was settled. And each assumption added another layer to what I was building, another point of clarity that would matter later. One night, as I sat in my room with the monitor softly transmitting their voices, I heard Emily say something that confirmed everything. Once the paperwork is done, there is nothing she can do. And Jason agreed without hesitation, and I closed my eyes for a moment, not in frustration, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because that sentence, simple as it was, revealed the exact moment they believed they would have complete control, and that meant I knew exactly when to act. I reached over and stopped the recording, saving the file with the same careful attention I had given all the others, and I placed my phone down beside me, my hands steady, my mind clear, because I understood now that this was no longer about uncovering their plan, it was about timing mine. And as I turned off the light and let the room settle into darkness, I realized that everything they were doing was leading them to a single point, a moment they believed would secure their future. And when that moment arrived, they would finally understand that it had never belonged to them at all. The following week arrived with a quiet sense of inevitability, not because anything had been openly decided, but because everything beneath the surface had already been set in motion, and I could feel it in the way Jason checked the time more often than usual, in the way Emily kept her voice measured and controlled whenever she spoke to me, as if she were rehearsing a version of reality that she wanted me to accept without question, and I continued to play my part just as carefully, calm, agreeable, present, giving them no reason to doubt that I was exactly where they expected me to be. The morning of the scheduled visit, Emily placed a brochure in front of me again, this time opening it to a page filled with bright rooms and smiling residents, her finger tracing along the descriptions as she spoke gently. They have private suites, activities, everything you would need. And I nodded, my expression thoughtful, my voice soft. It looks very nice. And I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the building itself, because what I was really acknowledging was how far they had come in constructing this illusion. Jason added something about how it would only be temporary at first, just until things settled, and I noticed the way he avoided saying anything definitive, leaving space for adjustment, for flexibility, for whatever version of the plan would be easiest to present later, and I allowed him that space because it told me exactly how uncertain he still was beneath his confidence. When we arrived at the facility, I took my time stepping out of the car, looking around, taking in the carefully maintained grounds, the clean walkways, the quiet order of the place, and I did not rush, I did not react, I simply observed the same way I had been observing everything else, because this was not about the facility, it was about confirming the final pieces of what they intended to do. Inside, a staff member greeted us with a practiced warmth, offering a tour, explaining the services, the routines, the benefits, and I listened politely, asking a few simple questions, the kind that made me appear engaged without revealing anything deeper. And all the while, I could feel Jason and Emily watching me, measuring my reactions, waiting for signs of resistance that never came. At one point, as we stood near a window overlooking a small garden, Emily leaned slightly toward Jason, her voice low but not low enough. "This will work," she said, and he nodded, a quiet agreement that carried more certainty than anything he had said out loud before. And in that moment I understood that they believed this was the turning point, the place where their plan would begin to become reality. I turned back toward them then, meeting their eyes with a calm that felt almost effortless, and I smiled, a small measured expression that gave them exactly what they wanted to see, acceptance, cooperation, readiness, and I said, "It seems like a good place." And the relief that passed between them was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, like a tension they had been holding had finally been released. But what they did not see, what they could not see, was that this moment, the one they believed confirmed everything, was not the beginning of their success, it was the completion of their exposure, because every word, every reaction, every assumption they had made had already been recorded, already documented, already positioned exactly where it needed to be. And as we left the building and walked back to the car, the sunlight falling evenly across the pavement, I realized that they were no longer planning something that might happen, they were stepping directly into something that already had an ending, they just did not know what it was yet. When we returned home that afternoon, everything appeared exactly as it had always been, the same quiet street, the same familiar front door, the same light filtering through the windows, and yet I could feel the difference in the way Jason moved, in the way Emily set her purse down with a sense of completion, as if something important had been decided, as if a door had quietly closed behind them without any need to say it out loud, and I stepped inside slowly, taking in the space with a calm awareness that no longer carried any doubt, because now I knew with certainty that they believed the next step would be easy. That evening, Jason brought up paperwork for the first time, not directly, not in a way that would raise concern, but gently, carefully, mentioning how there might be some forms to look over in the coming days, just standard procedures, nothing complicated, and I listened, nodding slightly, asking a simple question about timing, allowing him to explain it in more detail than he intended, because the more he spoke, the clearer their structure became, the sequence of actions, the order of decisions, the point at which they believed everything would be secured. Emily added that it would be easier if everything was handled sooner rather than later, her tone light but purposeful, and I could see how they were aligning their approach now, working together more openly, confident that I was no longer a variable they needed to account for, and that confidence made everything simpler for me. Later that night, when the house settled into silence once again, I sat at the table with my phone in front of me, reviewing the recordings from the past several days, listening not just to what was said, but to how it was said, the certainty in their voices, the assumptions they repeated, the way their plan depended entirely on the belief that I would not intervene, and I organized the files carefully, labeling each one with precise dates and times, creating a clear sequence that showed not just a moment of conversation but a pattern, a deliberate progression towards something they thought would go unquestioned. The next morning I made the final arrangements, quiet, efficient, and complete, confirming that every document was exactly where it needed to be, that every instruction had been clearly outlined, that every safeguard was in place, and when I finished I did not feel rushed or anxious. I felt settled, because there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to anticipate. Over the next 2 days I continued exactly as before, calm, cooperative, present, allowing them to move forward with their expectations, answering their questions with quiet agreement, accepting their suggestions with measured consideration, and I could see how much easier it had become for them, how little resistance they encountered, how natural it felt for them to believe that everything was unfolding according to their design. On the third evening, Jason mentioned that someone would be coming by at the end of the week to go over everything, his tone steady, almost relieved, and I met his words with the same composed response I had given all along. "That sounds fine," I said, and Emily smiled, a small, satisfied expression that lingered just long enough to reveal what she thought this meant, and I returned that smile, just as small, just as controlled, because I understood something they did not. The moment they were preparing for was not the moment they thought it would be. That night, as I sat in my room with the monitor beside me, I did not need to listen as closely as before, not because they had stopped talking, but because there was nothing left to uncover. Everything had already been said, everything had already been captured, and as I reached over and turned the device off for the first time since this began, I felt a quiet finality settle in, not as an ending but as a transition, because the next step would not require listening, it would require action, and as I set the monitor aside and looked out into the darkness beyond the window, I knew with complete certainty that when the end of the week arrived, nothing would go the way they expected, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that moment fully, not with anticipation but with clarity, because I was ready. The end of the week arrived without ceremony, just a quiet shift in the air that only I seemed to notice, and I woke up earlier than usual, not out of habit but out of clarity, because I knew exactly what this day represented, not the conclusion they were expecting, but the moment everything would be revealed for what it truly was, and as I moved through the house that morning, I did so with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar, steady and deliberate, as if every step had already been decided long before I took it. Jason was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, reviewing something on his tablet, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration, while Emily stood near the counter arranging cups as if she were preparing for something important, something formal, and when they both looked up at me, their expressions were composed, polite, carrying that same practiced concern they had refined over the past week, and I returned their look with the same quiet ease I had maintained all along. "He should be here around 10, Jason said, setting the tablet down, and I nodded once, taking a seat at the table, my hands resting lightly in front of me, because there was no need for movement now, no need for distraction. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. When the doorbell rang, Emily moved quickly to answer it, her posture straight, her voice warm as she greeted the man at the door, and I could hear the low exchange of introductions as they stepped inside, the sound of measured footsteps crossing the entryway, and then he appeared in the doorway, dressed neatly, carrying a folder, his expression professional and neutral, unaware of the role he was about to play in something far more significant than a simple consultation. We sat together in the living room, the three of us across from him, and he began to speak in a calm, structured tone, outlining the process, explaining the steps, referring to documents that would need to be reviewed and signed, and I listened without interruption, my gaze steady, my breathing even, because this was exactly what I had been waiting for, not the explanation itself, but the moment when everything would align in one place, one conversation, one clear sequence. Jason leaned forward slightly, asking a question about timing. Emily followed with something about next steps, and the man responded with careful detail, turning pages in his folder, pointing to sections, guiding them through what they believed was the final stage of their plan, and I let it continue just long enough for their confidence to fully settle, just long enough for them to believe that this was proceeding exactly as they intended. Then when the conversation reached its natural pause, when the man looked up from the documents and Jason glanced toward me with an expectant expression, I moved for the first time, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to reach into my bag and place my phone on the table between us, the screen already lit, already prepared, and I looked directly at Jason, then at Emily, my voice calm, measured and unmistakably clear. "Before we go any further," I said, "there is something you should hear." The room shifted instantly, not in sound, not in movement, but in something deeper, something that changed the weight of the moment itself, and without waiting for a response, I pressed play, and the first words that filled the room were his, unmistakable, undeniable, carried through the same device they had forgotten about, and I watched as the certainty in their expressions faltered, as understanding began to replace assumption, and I remained exactly where I was, composed still, because this was no longer about what they had planned, it was about what they could no longer deny. The sound of Jason's voice filled the room, steady at first, confident. The same tone he had used that night, but now there was no distance, no privacy to protect him, just the clear weight of his own words hanging in the air where everyone could hear them, and I watched as his posture changed, as the certainty drained from his face 1 second at a time, replaced by something slower, heavier, something that looked like realization but felt closer to exposure. Emily reached for his arm almost immediately, her fingers tightening as if she could steady the moment, but her eyes never left the phone, never left the source of the sound that was unraveling everything they had built in silence, and when her own voice followed his, quieter but just as unmistakable, I saw the exact instant she understood there was no explanation that would undo this. The man sitting across from us, the one they had invited to guide them through what they thought would be a simple process, had gone completely still, his professional composure holding, but his attention sharpened in a way that made it clear he was no longer observing a routine situation. He was witnessing something far more serious, something that carried implications beyond paperwork and signatures. I did not rush to speak, I did not interrupt the recording, I let it play just long enough for every intention, every assumption, every carefully planned step to be heard exactly as it had been spoken, because clarity was more powerful than confrontation, and when I finally reached forward and stopped the audio, the silence that followed was not uncertain, it was absolute. Jason's mouth opened, then closed, his gaze shifting from me to the phone and back again, searching for something that was no longer there, some version of this moment where he could still explain it away, but there was no space left for that, no room for misunderstanding. "Mom, he started, his voice unsteady in a way I had never heard before, and I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him harshly, but to stop what would only become unnecessary words. "You have already said everything," I replied, my tone calm, measured, leaving no room for argument. Emily tried next, her voice tighter, more controlled. "This is not what it sounds like," she said, but even as she spoke, the weakness in the statement was clear, because what it sounded like was exactly what it was, and we all knew it. I turned my attention to the man across from us, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had entered the house, and I spoke with the same steady clarity I had maintained from the beginning. "Before anything proceeds, I want it noted that I have documented evidence of intentional planning regarding my removal from this property under false pretenses," I said, each word precise, deliberate, leaving no ambiguity about what had just been revealed. He nodded slowly, his expression shifting into something more formal, more cautious, as he adjusted the folder in his hands, the pages inside no longer representing the same purpose they had a few minutes ago. Jason leaned back slightly, as if the distance might give him space to think, to recover, but the reality of the situation had already closed in around him, and Emily's grip on his arm tightened again, not in reassurance now, but in uncertainty. I remained where I was, composed, steady, not raising my voice, not adding anything unnecessary, because the moment did not require more, it required recognition, and as I looked at both of them, seeing them not as they had presented themselves over the past week but as they truly were in this moment, I understood something with complete clarity. They had built their entire plan on the belief that I would never see it, and now that I had, there was nothing left for them to stand on. Jason's hands were still shaking when I reached forward and gently turned the phone screen off, not to stop the truth, but because it had already done its job. Every word had landed exactly where it needed to, and there was nothing left to prove. The man across from us cleared his throat slightly, adjusting his posture as he closed the folder in front of him with careful precision, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed completely, no longer guiding, no longer cooperative, but formal, distant, and unmistakably cautious. "Given what has just been presented," he said, "I cannot proceed with any documentation under these circumstances." And the weight of that sentence settled immediately, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that neither Jason nor Emily could ignore. Emily was the first to react, her voice tight, strained. "There must be some misunderstanding. This is just taken out of context," she said, but even as she spoke, her words felt thin, unsupported, because context does not erase intention, and intention had already been heard clearly. I did not respond to her, I did not need to, because the evidence had already spoken in a way that no explanation could undo. Jason leaned forward then, his voice lower, almost desperate. "Mom, we were just trying to help," he said, and for the first time I saw not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a plan collapses before it even begins, and I looked at him steadily, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something far more decisive. "You were trying to remove me," I said calmly, "so you could take what you believed was yours." And I let that truth sit between us, clear and unchallenged. The man stood then, gathering his things with quiet efficiency. "I would strongly advise that no further actions are taken without legal counsel present for all parties," he added, and with that, he walked toward the door, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything that had been said. I reached into my bag once more, placing a second set of documents on the table, sliding them forward just enough for Jason and Emily to see, and this time I did not wait for them to ask. "The property has already been transferred," I said, my voice steady, precise, "into an irrevocable trust managed independently. You have no authority over it, no access and no claim." And I watched as the realization settled over them, slower than the shock before, but far more permanent. Jason's face went pale as he scanned the first page, his eyes moving quickly, searching for something that would change what he was reading. But there was nothing there for him to find. "You did this without telling us," he said quietly, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "I did this because you did not think I would," I replied. Emily stepped back slightly, her composure finally breaking, the confidence she had carried all week slipping away completely, replaced by something uncertain, something exposed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that could restore what they had just lost. I stood then, slowly smoothing my hands over the front of my coat, and, for the first time since this began, I felt no need to remain seated, no need to stay in a position of waiting. "There is also a formal report filed regarding financial exploitation," I added, not raising my voice, not emphasizing the words, simply stating them as fact, because that is what they were now, documented, recorded, undeniable. Jason looked up sharply. "You would not do that," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice, only disbelief, and I allowed myself a small, controlled pause before answering. "I already have," I said. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, the kind that does not invite response because it has already concluded the conversation. I picked up my bag, turning toward the door, and as I reached for the handle, I stopped just long enough to speak one final time. Not loudly, not emotionally, but with a clarity that left no room for anything else. "You thought I was alone," I said, "but I was listening." And then I opened the door and stepped outside, leaving them behind in a house they could no longer control, with a future they had already lost, and for the first time in a long time I did not look back.